Ciclos rituales de claridad transforman en la maestría, donde las intenciones corren en el horizonte de la conciencia. Serpiente de viajes de la oscuridad en la matriz de creación. Nace.
So hello, we are starting the second panel. It is perhaps a bit more like not so true because most of the all the people in this panel are coming from the, let's say, fringes of black metal. Like Adin here is mostly from the crust scene, and we'll talk about red and anarchist black metal. And the second speaker is Jasna Babić from Gromka, the organizer of punk concerts. And the third is Truntel, who will speak about typo negative and its connections to black metal. So, without further ado, I will leave you the stage.
Okay. Is it okay? Okay. Hello, everyone. As Mir said, I'm Adin Crnkić, and I will focus on the new wave of far-left ideology within black metal music, which is known as red and anarchist black metal, or RABM. So. RABM is a political philosophy of black metal in which the artists have various far-left and environmentalist ideologies such as anarchism, Marxism, communism, anti-fascism, anti-Nazism, and green anarchism, and so on. So it was actually born from the intersection of anarcho-crust punk ideology and black metal. But I think that this umbrella, some kind of umbrella term is oversimplified, because many of these scenes, bands are overtly political, of course, with some kind of clear manifestos, while others are only tangentially linked and would not necessarily endorse or acknowledge an affiliation with RABM. For example, you heard for Cascadian black metal band like Wolves in the Throne Room. So musically, this genre ranges from crust, or actually in this matter of fact is blackened crust, and next are, for example, atmospheric black metal, folk black metal, depressive black metal, and so on. So we can see that this genre encompasses a broad range of ideas, philosophy, and theories. So for the purposes of this presentation, I would allow myself strictly to distinguish between black metal and RABM. So what is this distinction between them? It could be said, firstly, that this classic black metal is reactionary, conservative, and some writers would. Okay, thanks. And some writers would even claim that's inherently Nazi. But I would put pretty mildly to say it's definitely not leftist as some other musical genres. So, to the contrary to the black metal, I think that RABM strives towards formation of radical political subjectivity. So that, for example, revolution. Classical black metal is founded on fragments, on the lonely details. Speaking philosophically, it ignores dialectics because it neglects the future. So actually, black metal is not interested in what will become, but in my opinion, it focuses on what it is now or in the present, but mostly what is in the past. So that is why black metal so much emphasizes ethnicity and national identity on the one hand, and the idea of this kind of folkish ideology, this pagan, in a way, on the other side. One second, please. such act is in correlation with this integration of human personality, and that is precisely this misanthropic foundation on which rests human psychology. So I talk about actually, in a way, illogical belief in myths. Conservative mythologies, which are in majority, are conservative primarily because they are unreal and irrational. And this focus on cults of the past that is mostly pagan and focus on history and full of melancholic and poetic past driven with nature fall in category which can be called irrational regression. So black metal in a way insists on its own radical autonomy and musically and ideologically also it's in a way this permanent conflict with the mainstream culture. So it is distinguished from the other musical genres also by its aesthetics, the form of nihilism, despair, misanthropy, self-destructiveness, and anti-humanism. And in my opinion, this is one of the important differences between RABM and classic black metal, because they are basically diametrically opposite. So RABM also carries this radical social contact and it fights for a struggle for future anti-capitalist utopian world. Most of all, RABM came actually as a response to growing national socialist black metal scene. So black metal, is classical, is on the other side often treated as a kind of ritualistic medium for personal transformation. But there are some kind of commonalities that exist between black metal discourse and other discourses with the scene as a whole. So, for example, Christianity is widely reviled, as are other forms of authority. This was some kind of first part of my presentation, a little bit philosophical and so on. So please allow me to pass on the second part of this presentation. So for the purposes, of course, of this presentation, I will use only a few examples of RABM bands. So it's probably not necessary to particularly point out that there are dozens of such bands. It's, however, what strikes me the most is how recent this rise of the far right, alt-right, or actual fascism overall, in a way radicalized black metal community. And because most of all these bands are 2 or maybe even less years old. So let me actually show you a few examples. First is Jarost Marxa, which can be translated to the rage of Marx. That band come from Moscow, and I think they are now defunct. They don't play anymore. As you can see, the name is written in the Russian Cyrillic writing system. And here you have an example of one of their lyrics. Okay, I didn't put everything, but you actually probably got the point. It's basically communist black metal. And if I move the next band, which is really brilliant for me personally, it's actually Mark's Throne. You got a point, I don't need to talk about anything. Yeah, this band is I think 1 year old and really brilliant. So I really recommend to check them out. They have a band camp. Of course, this is one of their songs. Yeah, so yeah. You know, they mentioned like Richard Spencer and brilliant. When I listen to those bands, sometimes I don't know if they are serious or not. Of course, the topic is serious, of course, but the lyrics are like fantastic. So this is the other part of this. And we mentioned Jordan Peterson. Because, okay, I'm glad that this is funny. Okay, next example is a band, Congregation of Horns, which is more serious, openly anti-NSBM band. I found this band, it's actually from the January. They put this album, A Pit of Nazi Skulls, on the band camp. So yeah, the lyrics are pretty much more serious. If I move on, we have a band Puna Terori from Finland. It means red terror. It's also like Jaros Marx, a communist black metal, and it describes itself as a Marxist, Leninist, and communist band. And I think that there are only few. I mean that Puna Terori and Jaros Marx are only one that openly Marxist-Leninist. Here is also example of the lyrics, and really like a national anthem. Okay. Next is band Sankara, also totally new band. Unfortunately, I didn't find any lyrics. They are named after Burkinabe Marxist revolutionary Thomas Sankara. Also, their album is called Total Liberation of the Human Race. And next, band Gaylord, which caught my eye because they use absurd humor to fight NSBM and considers themselves as a true anti-authoritarian fascist beheading black metal. Their style which is basically identical to the pioneers of such style, I didn't put it there, Neckbeard Death Camp. And in a way, they both reminds me of a grindcore band, NL Kant, if you know it. What is interesting me, I have one quote from this artist, Gaylord. Is actually most of these bands are one-man band. So, yeah. I have a quote from Gaylord, and she said that music about orcs fucking in the woods is cool and all that, but sometimes you need to realize that you don't have to divorce yourself from reality to find villains to fight. After all, who's more terrifying, the UK conservatives or Sauron? So this basically puts, this sentence is really sum up. Okay, I came to the end of this presentation, so thank you for your visiting and listening, and so yeah, thank you. Are there now questions or the next? After? Okay.
everybody. My name is Jasna. At the beginning, when I was deciding about the title and about the content of this presentation, I actually didn't really know what to write about. So I put a really general title and a general description of the abstract. So the title is Too Old and Too Cold, Black Metal and Contemporary Subcultural Theory. But however, after then I started to write the presentation, I kind of focused on identity, transgression, and concept of the subcultural capital. So it's going to be a lot of theory. It will not be so fun as the presentation that we just have seen, but I hope you will bear with me. So here we go. And I will read a lot because obviously it's not really simple. When describing or exploring the daily life of subcultures, it is inevitable to include the level of subcultural experience and construction of subcultural identity, a set of attributes and way of acting, experiencing, and thinking in which our individual recognizes themselves and others. And there is hardly a subcultural phenomenon that would emphasize a conflict between the power of the individual and the collective identity in such way as formed through the black metal genre. It has been decades since the foundations of black metal were set. During this time, various cultural and political forms were created, which upgraded, changed, as well as loosened its aesthetic and ambivalence between emphasized individualism and collective identity, thus opened the question of authenticity and affiliation. The black metal scene has developed as a radical, or better say, a fundamentalist response to the excess of popularity of 1980s heavy metal. In the beginning, the term black metal was used to refer to satanic and occultist forms of extreme metal. However, in the late 80s and early 90s, the Norwegian black metal scene merged the music and practice as an impression of an essential identity and formed a spectacular, serious, and uncompromising satanic vision of metal. The essence of black metal unfolded the rejection of mundane, the modern, humanity, and entertainment in favor of attempting to be genuinely satanic and evil. Norwegian, or true black metal, worshipped a heroic, pure past, uncontaminated by the weakening influence of Christianity. The purity is achieved through transgression of the individual, which in practice could be implemented in various ways, with deeply distorted low-fi cacophonic music, accompanied by inhuman, agonizing screams, then the lyric contents. For example, the concert being transformed into a religious event, a ritual, with an emphasized ceremonial aesthetic and dehumanization, score paints, monk robes, well, you know it, self-mutilation, and so on. The stage becomes a sanctuary, dimming, fog, candles, spraying of blood, carcass, and so on. While in the daily life, one should seek the abandonment of moral values, for example, behave in violent way, or and so on. Subcultural theory usually focus on two types of relationship. One being the relationship between members and the other, which means insiders and outsiders, and then the relationship between members in particular subcultural group, which it's basically focused on internal dynamics. In black metal, the latter is particularly interesting because it is based on the eternal conflict between the preferred hyper-individuality and subjectivity, and the attempt to create instrumental relationship within members in the black metal scene. The division between the insider, the black metaler, and the other, the outsider, which includes both members of other metal scenes and the wider society, is the basis for establishing the subcultural identity. It enables an individual self-understanding, how others understand them, and above all, how to distinguish the self from the others. The division always contains an element of power. The distinction between subcultures and other does not represent an equivalent relationship, but usually contains a specific requirement, a call to authority, where the inferiority of the other is already foreseen. Black metal directly embodies this relationship. Its entire existence is based on the opposition, to differ from others, At the time of the creation of the black metal scene itself, its founders were literally obsessed with condemnation, labeling fans and members of other metal genres and posers, as posers and trend followers, and equated them with the rest of the society. By worshipping purity, black metalers have set radical foundations. By practicing violence, evils worshipping, sharing sympathy with totalitarianism or neo-Nazism, and through the misanthropy, they wanted to draw clear boundaries to cut themselves off from the other subcultural scenes and the wider society. On the other hand, identity inside subculture is linked to the status that member gains, or it is attributed to them by the remaining members of the subcultural group. The status can be inherited, for example, by the line of siblings, like you are a brother of somebody who is already in the scene, or acquired according to the organization and the method of sorting within the subculture. You're a member of the band, and so on. The value status varies and changes all the time. It can change according to the activity, such as quitting, for example, first you are a member of the band and then you quit and you switch only being like a concert visitor or something. Or it can be related to behavior when one person is known first as friendly, but then of some single event, he is labeled as a loser, rude, something like that, and of course opposite and vice versa. In order to define the internal relationship between members in subcultures, Sarah Thornton relied on the concept of the Bourdieu in the relationship between taste and social structure, and introduced an additional subcategory of subcultural capital to illustrate the measure of strength or weakness of subcultural status. Subcultural capital can be objectivized or embodied, and it grants its holder to a status according to the importance of the other. It objectivizes through, for example, collection of albums, and embodies a stylish image. Similarly, subcultural capital can be reflected by the use of the correct slang, special gestures, and so on. Members of subculture learn through the secondary nature, that is informal knowledge, what is considered right or appropriate. Mostly importantly, the behavior, clothes, and other rules of a particular subcultural style are not exaggerated or copied, since nothing exhausts subcultural capital more as an insight that someone is striving too much. Authenticity does not exist in itself. It is always inextricably linked to a particular object, person, or action. Authenticity is the process that is constantly in progress. It changes through space and time, requires constant effort and demonstration, and never reaches a final stage. Authenticity as a concept is never spoken about in a practice, but at the level of everyday relationship, the assessment of authenticity is always going on, especially on the basis of differentiation, that is, the division of people, practices, and objects into a real, fake, or copycats. Khan Harry's study of subcultural capital in the extreme metal scene, subgenre, defines two main forms of cultural capital. One is mundane subcultural capital, which includes characteristics already described by Sarah Thornton, while he adds a new one and names it transgressive subcultural capital. Both types of the capital are struggled over and contested by scene members in their attempt to gain power, status, and capital within the scene. First one, mundane subcultural capital, represents a space of collective power. In this sense, scene members show their alliance toward the scene through over-display of scenic knowledge and being in the know, particularly focused on the use of eternal, specialized terminology and knowledge about historical narratives, systems of classification, and large numbers of obscure bands, such as by describing the sound of the band in relation to a fine-grained subgeneric classification. So you know the ambient, black metal, depressive and suicidal black metal, and so on. Through its emphasis of scene-specific knowledge, mundane subcultural capital is accumulated through an active participation and commitment to the scene. It applies to all: bands, promoters, record labels, music newspapers, zines, blogs, and devoted fans and supporters. By engaging with the scene and participating in the culture, they help to ensure the scene is experienced as a collective instead of a group of individuals who simply happen to share the same taste of music. On the other hand, transgressive subcultural capital is claimed where members are critical of the notion of committing and contributing to the sustaining of a collective scene. Transgressive subcultural capital is claimed through a radical individualism, through displaying uniqueness and a lack of attachment to the scene. Transgressive subcultural capital continues an insider-outsider dichotomy within its own black metal scene. In time of true Norwegian black metal, it was stated there is no friendship among black metalers, only people working together to achieve the same goal. Just as black metal fans seek to distance their scene from the mainstream, increasing transgressive subcultural capital in the black metal scene involves creating a distance between themselves and other members of the scene whom they label as uncommitted because they might be only superficially or mundanely invested in relation to the music on which the subgenre is based. The rules around what can be defined as transgressive in the scene are being contested constantly, with practices which were once considered transgressive soon being normalized and becoming mundane. Nowadays, self-mutilation on the stage or spilling blood on the audience can be unpleasant, but it doesn't create a shock to the extent it used to in the past. As Can Harris posits, while transgressive subcultural capital circulates within the extreme metal scene, its attachment to the scene is contingent and pragmatic. To possess transgressive subcultural capital is to be a part of the scene, but not of the scene. Although at the first glance it seems that two capitals are in opposition, they are both important for the black metal scene and they complement each other in a way. Mundane subcultural capital ensures that individuals remain committed to the scene while pursuing transgression keeps the scene from stagnating, promoting individualism and innovation within the subgenre. This leads to a culture where artists are encouraged to innovate musically in order to gain the transgressive subcultural capital, but not too much for fear of being denounced by scene members who are mostly invested in mundane subcultural capital. Skading states that black metal has particularly overt scene-specific measure of subcultural capital that encapsulates both mundane and well as transgressive subcultural capital. It is often termed cult or cultness, so you know the name, KLBT. The meaning of cult is flexible and it can describe different aspects when applied to different situations, objects, or people. Cult is a measure of authenticity. However, there are diverse ways the term is applied within communities in black metal fans. A focus on insularity and exclusion remains constant. Cultness in the context of discussing a band among fans frequently refers to the stylistic choices, narrative content of recordings and performance associated with that band. Referring to musical style, being cult also often refers to use the raw or low production values and to recording distribution. The criteria that might make a black metal band cult are complex, but the term is mostly often associated with the reproduction of stylistic choices of the second wave of 19th black metal. However, when used to describe black metal fans, Hagen argues cultness takes on shady of irony, humor, and playfulness. Used as a form of derision, the term is often applied to people who are seen as appropriating aesthetic of black metal in a way that is seen that is trying too hard to be transgressive. In this sense, in contemporary black metal fan communities, cult awakens the humor and glimpse of entertainment which was lost in the beginning of the 90s. While encouraging individual music expression and innovation, transgression also allows that almost anything within the black metal scene is tolerated, can be publicly said and potentially used in a discourse. It even welcomes offensive behavior, for example, on internet-based communities like Reddit. Appreciation for aesthetic shock value and overall offensiveness constantly points out that nothing matters much as music within extreme metal scene. No difference, conflict, or debate can ever be allowed to overshadow this, argues Can Harris. From the gender aspect, for example, the problem is the same. Transgression encourages solo projects, as Adin also mentioned. There is a lot of time solo band or a duo instead of full bands. And for example, therefore, women have a greater chance to experience themselves as a musician without being slowed down by the process of searching for a band members. If transgressive subcultural capital enables liberation and creation, at the same time it ignores the problematic relationships that are shaped in the process, like possible problem of sexism, which is also presented within the scene. When it comes to politics, racist and fascist discourse may be challenged, yet pursuing such debates cannot be allowed to happen as an end in itself, and no difference can ever be elevated in importance above the essentially musicality of the scene. Non-music debates raise the specter of politics, and this is seen as an absolutely antithetical to music. In a way, we can argue that in public sphere, transgressive identities and implacable stances are proclaimed to maintain the rise of subcultural capital. However, those stances occasionally have serious consequences, and when it do, non-music debates will and must continue. Thank you. Any questions? No? Thank you.
So my theme is analysis of themes of misogyny and racism in music of type O negative, and how this relates to black metal. I'll get to that part. So let's begin, I guess. April 14 this month, I'll also be reading because there's some theoretical stuff, so whatever. April 14 this month marked the 19th anniversary of type O negative's Peter Steele's sudden death due to aortic aneurysm. Prior to this unexpected event, the band had just finished a series of concerts in October 2009, which culminated on Halloween's Eve show in Harpo's Concert Theater, Detroit. It was reported that he had just begun enjoying a long period of sobriety from cocaine and alcohol abuse, and he had also started to write material for the band's Untitled upcoming album, which was a supposed follow-up from their 7th studio effort, ironically titled Dead Again, released in 2007. After the tragic incident, the remaining members of type O negative issued a statement that the band had most definitely split up, and that even if there is somebody who could take Steele's place, it wouldn't matter. We don't have any interest in continuing. It's impossible. It hasn't even come up in any kind of discussion. When Peter died, type O negative died with him. And almost a decade later, it would be an understatement to say that the band is still enjoying a wholesome amount of popularity and praise, despite the undoubtful impossibility of a certain reunion. It would also be an understatement to think that the controversy surrounding their alleged connection to themes of misogyny, racism, and speciesism has at all not cleared the fundamental misunderstanding of their intentions, however innocent or purely reactionary they may seem to be at the time. The historical context of neoliberal backlash and capitalist realism in the 70s and 80s emerged as a form of political, economic, ideological, and cultural opposition to the revolutionary movements of the mid-20th century, and in turn also signaled a radical turn in the practice of theory and emancipatory endeavors. The subsequent depolitization of all spheres of life thus most certainly shook apart, with notable exceptions, the wholeness of creative processes situated in the functioning of the music industry. Black metal subculture, along with other branches of extreme metal, first appears as a fundamentalist response to the excess and popularity of 1980s heavy metal. I might be repeating some stuff because me and Jasna apparently read from the same article, so excuse me. Extreme metal scene radicalized certain characteristics of heavy metal. It featured faster-paced songs, affinity for darker imagery and violent topics, and also a steadily blooming community of metalheads, bound together by certain master signifier of what was primarily a musical scene in the last instance. Black metal affirmed a serious satanic vision of metal that attempted to merge music and practice as an expression of an essential identity. The scene attempted to be genuinely satanic and evil, and in 1994, Norwegian black metal scene specifically gained notorious widespread attention after a series of murders, church arsons, and satanic rituals. These events were most predominantly documented in Moynihan's and Soderling's book called Lords of Chaos, that revealed the supposed misanthropy and hatred that led to the Norwegian murders. The book also details other murders in Germany, America, and Sweden. It also examines the fascist and racist views of many involved in black metal, including Varg Vikernes, who has, as of today, become an outright Nazi, as we can see on his YouTube channel. What the eccentricities of such pompous journalism seem to conceal is that the specificity of the 1990s Norwegian black metal scene resulted from a peculiar set of interactions at a particular time and place. It has already been described through Anthony Giddens's concept of reflexivity that the space of the scene was mostly a product of heterogeneous setting of elements that challenged the very unchangeability of social structures in the modern world setting. One could talk about the reflexive anti-reflexivity of black metal music, which was constructed as a depoliticizing category, transgressing and transforming the lines separating the private from the public, and thus the discursive from non-discursive. Leaving aside a number of bands that actually flirted seriously with the far-right music scene, the ethos of disengagement within the extreme metal scene in general ensured that the racistly and chauvinistically dim practices are adequately contested, so they did not come to dominate the scene. The opposition to racism was thus less political than it was pragmatic, because excessive racism just becomes moronic, but not a front to a particular ideological position. The use of such discourses then restricts the efficacy of political to an intervention in the public scene, designed to have an impact on certain social institutions, but this in turn entails the removal of an autonomous view of music from the social structure. Bottom line is that the scene is driven by divisions of capital that can function completely differently from the official belief of what the supposed racism and fascism at the center of black metal community signals. Around the same time, in a rather different subcultural setting, Typo Negative formed from the remains of a project called Repulsion. Prior to this, the band's frontman Peter Steele had been acting in a number of crossover, thrash, and even heavy metal bands around the Brooklyn scene that came into being after the third wave of punk, today known as hardcore. Steele's affiliation with such a diverse palette of musical interests most definitely shaped the future sound of Typo Negative that during the 90s became most certainly associated with the ever-growing gothic metal scene. What will interest me in this context, however, is a specific discursive practice that is similar to the transgressions inside the before evaluated black metal community. The deliberate political incorrectness and satire of Steele's lyricism added to his rather infamous persona as a sort of mentally unstable, sexist, and racist leader of a conservative metal band that over the years brought on, quite understandably, but at times definitely reactively, so much confusion as to whether its assumed National Socialist roots are to be taken seriously. I will attempt to analyze some of the band's more prominent songs that were the target of such accusations, and through application of some general Lacanian and Althusserian concepts, I shall tackle the problematic formation of Typo Negative's political practice, or rather the level of applicable performative language, which most certainly wasn't without the specter of humorous and ironical elements. What follows is thus a fragmentary outlook on the band's repertoire that was a part of a certain historical conjuncture inside the musical scene, keen on transgressing the established views of normativity, sexuality, and ideological class struggle. The first object of the analysis is the song called Der Untermensch from the band's debut album titled Slow, Deep and Hard, released in 1990. The song evolves from a slow-paced, gloomy and atmospheric premise, accompanied by keyboardist Josh Silver's hammering synth percussion and Steele's droning razor-sharp bass line to what seems to be a certain industrial working man's environment setting. After this supposed introductory scenery of arduousness and misery that the life of a manual laborer supposedly represents, we are suddenly met with a change in song's tempo and praising, immediately followed by Steele's interpellative hook of, "Hey you on public assistance, why don't you get a job?" What is here established is a field of undifferentiated but stereotypical order that figures very prominently in various nationalist, racist discourses, blaming people of different deprivileged ethnical, sexual, cultural origins for either stealing the natives' jobs or figuring as social parasites, as the constantly repeated line in the song suggests later on. It is interesting, however, that this vertically interpolated order is neither in the function of a racially or culturally colored lyrical technique. Given that the band hailed from globally cosmopolitan ambience of ethnically diverse everyday life of Brooklyn Borough, it is not hard to see how the song's lines such as "sell some dope and buy some pride, it's the only thing you couldn't rob," or "getting fucked up on Carson Avenue, smoking crack and drinking booze" could refer to the strong African-American strata situated between the various surrounding minorities, as certain interpretations suggest. Still himself told in an interview from 90s that he has no respect for lazy slobs, choosing to live off their government's back and not contributing anything to society, confirming his rather right-wing views. But what is here symptomatic are two things. The first one pertains to the status of the before-mentioned interpolation of the stereotypical order, and the second one figures in the very title of the problematized song. It is doubtful that Steele read a lot of Nietzsche, if any, and he chose the song's name to be Der Untermensch for purely reactionary purposes, in stirring the everlasting controversy surrounding the imagery of Nazism, without realizing it's actually Stoddard's variation of the famous Übermensch. I'd like to build upon the context and the meaning of this concept in relation to the doubly productive characteristic of ideological misrecognition in the workings of interpellation. The whole point of this term, in the text of Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, which Althusser articulated in the wake of Chinese Cultural Revolution, was to uncover the very real of the complex class structure torn apart by different types of antagonisms and contradictions. Ideological interpellation, along with ideological state apparatuses, is inscribed in the space of these contradictions. It is an essential mechanism of ideology operating in the Lacanian register of imaginary where, in short, identifications and the subject's basic sense of self take place. What at first seems like a struggle for meaning between the spectral relation of the two famous objects is actually the struggle itself, concealed by the effort of approaching it with a gesture of finding within it a deeper affair of things. The spontaneous ideology of everyday discursive practice as a form of representational ideology in the song Der Untermensch comes in the form of a homogenized stereotypical category of the social parasite, the man on public assistance, that points to the very concept of dialectics in the wings of the structure, which is a non-dialectical structure of the empty and present time of the masses. In this sense, I argue the very ideological misrecognition of the condition of ideological representation can be productive. Peter Steele's politically incorrect, ruthless description of the miserable status of American working class in the slums and ghettos of US metropolises, abandoned by the regulative functions of its government, takes no remorse in deconstructing the fictitious, fake egalitarian schema of symbolic identifications, propagating solidarity through unison of different and universal, as evident in an almost tragic tone of their execution. He does not do this by overly preaching it, but by laying before us the whole cold bare facts, even though in an aggressive manner. Testament to this is the repetitive exclamation of the line, "You're a waste of life," which, although being a spontaneous appropriation of an ideological stance of the desperate survivalist in the camp of small capital, works in an almost excessive, shocking kind of way. The song's ramblings point to the very impossibility of the homogeneous constitution of symbolic order, the very traumatic kernel of its foundation, the real of the class struggle that is being fought on different levels of society and in different shapes. If the interpolative statement of "Hey, you on public assistance" succeeds, it succeeds precisely because it implies a necessary short circuit, an illusion of the type I already was there. In this sense, it also represents a moment or an acknowledgement of a misrecognition, which is most certainly unavoidable. Or as Zizek would say, no wonder you were interpolated as a proletarian when you are a proletarian. Steele's lyrical intervention is thus, on the other hand, an intervention in the field of the stereotypical political discourse, centered around the figure of a quasi-victimized underman or a commoner, as it serves to expose its moralistic pretensions of embracing the ever so popular ideology of the dominated against the dominative. The point does not lie in the naive recognition or identification with one of these sides, or more likely the victims in this case, but rather in the affirmation of their critical boiling point in the form of a political and economic class struggle that can also take place in the field of ideology or culture. This is done precisely through the subversion of the ideals of dominant ideology, which are, as Etienne Balibar correctly observes, always the ideals of the dominated, the forgotten, the supposedly victimized. Steele took this thesis even more seriously in his previous 80s crossover thrash metal project named Carnivore, where he took advantage of the then popular ideology of the paranoia, which was based around the idea of a possible nuclear outbreak. Along with this dilemma of mutually assured destruction also came a widespread pseudoscientific propaganda schema about the possibility of surviving this hypothetical apocalyptic scenario. It signaled a sort of paradoxical, moronic idea of moving beyond simple class structure through forced awareness and fear-mongering about ecological disasters, which do not care about racial and ethnical differences, in which these are actually abolished. The music of Carnivore took the best, or rather the worst, of the both worlds, and created a ridiculous imaginarium of a devastated post-apocalyptic world, where thermonuclear warriors fight the everlasting battle for survival, where no man, regardless of his religion or race, is safe before the assured continuation of human conflict, and where that which cannot be factored must be killed. What we see here is a certain privileging of the impossibility of the peaceful resolution of mankind's fundamental antagonisms, which survive even the most daring, if not simply stupid human efforts to play the contradictory game of sustenance through unsatisfied destructive urge. And what of the sexual themes in the band's repertoire? Steele supposedly wrote the band's debut in one sitting while being drunk and after finding out his long-standing girlfriend had cheated on him. Looking back at the finished product of what became Slow, Deep and Hard, he tried to disown the work and said that it was only supposed to be a demo, and that if he had to do it over, Bloody Kisses would be the first album. The record is thus monumental in its rage against feminine betrayal, its lyrical content startling, even if it did originate in a place of hopeless rage. The opener of the album is the infamous Bohemian Rhapsody of Being Cheated On, titled Unsuccessfully Coping with Natural Beauty of Infidelity, and it became known through a memorable pre-chorus chant of "Slut, you're a fucking whore, you're a cunt," followed by Steele's ironic and self-deprecating revelation oriented around the fact that he knows that she is fucking someone else. The playful psychotic archetype that builds its weight around metonymic repetition of the before-mentioned lines paints a burlesque, if not simply humorous picture of undeniable downward spiral that is the recognition of a factual impasse. This absurdist situation reaches its peak with the next song, Zero Tolerance, where the narrator's intentions are more clear. Staring down at your sweaty embraces, put my tool right through your faces. Well, buddy, I hope you enjoyed her, cause I'm an equal opportunity destroyer. The album fades out with Jimi Hendrix cover of Hey Joe, renamed into Hey Pete. Here the gun becomes an axe, the old lady a whore. The excessiveness of Steele's humor, or supposed humor, according to Freud's account, originates from a process of victimization. While humor here is a certain triumph of narcissism, the mechanisms of superego comfort and protect the ego from suffering by saying that its concerns are, in the last instance, inconsequential. The resentimental core of Steele's ambivalent aggressivity toward his loved ex-girlfriend culminates in an almost parodic attempt at self-mutilation and thus participates in both the logics of revenge and it was just a joke mentality. With Bloody Kisses and October Rust, Steele abandons the overly violent misogyny of Type O Negative's first releases in favor of what appear to be a more insidious forms of sexism. The most interesting and important piece here is the song Christian Woman, which helped push Bloody Kisses to gold and eventually platinum status. Seemingly, the song's lyrical themes touch on religious allegory, temptation, and sexuality, but what figures as its epic and refreshing touch is the actual discrepancy between lyrical and instrumental content. One could say that on the imaginary level of the Lacanian register, the 80s almost new wavy sounding melodic structures of the song harbor a sort of a possibility for a certain identification on the completely senseless note. I deem that what strikes as the most important is the comical interplay between symbolic, the lyrical, and the real of the song's content. If its featured symbolism centers around the Christian woman's complicated pondering of her relationship with God, then her real-life counterpart asks Peter Steele to dress as a priest before he incorporates with her. She was a Roman Catholic, much as I am, but she would get off on breaking the rules a little bit. She would ask me to dress up as a priest, and well, I guess you can just imagine what would happen after that, Steele recalls. Given this fact, I argue that the song's content is structured both comically and ironically in the Lacanian sense of the word. It is ironic and humorous in the sense that the object of the song, the fantasies of Christian women coupling with Peter Steele as a priestly incarnation of Jesus Christ, is in a way introjected, reflected, and on the other hand, it is comical because it still forcibly evaluates itself on the blind contingency of the flight of desire. Christian woman's naive, faithful trust in the sexual object of Corpus Christi, as the repeatedly uttered lyrics suggest, takes on a form of a solution of fundamental non-relationship, so dearly common in both love and comedy. Her lustful deviation, for which she'll burn in hell, is not a desire for God himself, but for rather a mortal man who does not know any better and who sarcastically repeats the structuration of her delusional wishes only to thus desacralize them. The band's political neutrality was a well-documented fact. The song We Hate Everyone trivializes political differences and affirms the spiteful relationships to both left-wing and right-wing mentalities. Peter Steele famously and rather jokingly expressed his admiration for both Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler and described himself as a hedonistic individualist. If the band's discursive practice mirrored that of the black metal scene in many cases and thus scorned the realm of emancipatory political endeavors, questioning the relations of power and social problematic, or at least didn't actively participate in them, I think that this symptomatic at least puts us on a rocky road of re-evaluating our own concepts and representations of the utopian politics in the 21st century. Both sides did not come and go without their toils. They passively aggressively tailored an apolitical vision of a survivalist ideology backed up by capitalist realism. But at the same time, through inadvertent intervention in a conceptual and left-wing political space, they also open the possibility of a new theoretical formulation. It is here that we should start.
Thank you all for the presentations, and now the questions.
I have just one commentary on it's Peter Steele wrote a song, Public Assistance, for hardcore band Agnostic Front in the late 80s, which was a band, it was like a working class skinhead hardcore band fronted with Puerto Rican guy. So this is a controversial thing that when these working class people who formed this band approach this hate toward social parasites. But in that song maybe it was not really racism, but more conservatism, and just a comment.
Yeah, I mean, they never openly admitted they were even political, and in this sense, I think that this was just my interpretation, of course, but I think that this is like a working man's intervention in a political discourse, which I think is actually, it's like a way of defending the working man's ideology of, because looking at the status of American social working class, it's pretty bad out there. So I guess it was like at least I think that's my interpretation, is that this Steele's intervention is actually like has like an idea behind it that maybe stop victimizing and do something about it, because the social system in America, the social wages, the public assistance is so deftly low there that nobody can even survive on it, So I think that's just my interpretation. Of course, the band wasn't political. They probably weren't thinking in this way. So, but yes, I realized that at the beginning of Steele's career, also at carnivore shows, there were a lot of Nazis. So yeah, but just there's something true to it, if you ask me. But I'm a communist, so.
Anyone else? Then perhaps I have a question for Adin. How did you choose the bands that you presented? Perhaps you told already, but I did not hear. Why did you omit the Latin American communist scene, for example?
Thank you for the question. Actually, I choose the bands because I think they are really special. I could pick Iskra, which is probably the most known RABM representative. Although they rejects this term and actually doesn't want to have anything with Marxist, for example. Maybe yes. Maybe I choose those bands because they are different from the others things. As you've seen in the lyrics, for example, the last one, Gaylord, that's actually totally new way of anti-NSBM scene. I hope I answered your question. So, okay.
Hi, yeah, I've also got a question for Adin. You sort of mentioned, although I don't think any of the bands who came up sort of really represented it, but sort of elements of green anarchism in black metal and sort of how that ties in with like the Cascadian and atmospheric scenes. And I was just, I know like Wolves in the Throne Room don't really tie in with that, but they will sort of espouse a general kind of leftist persuasion sort of when asked about it. But I was wondering if, because currently there's also this rise in eco-conservatism on, extreme right-wing political movements, and presumably actually some of the like NSBM stuff as well, if there were sort of any tensions that you could talk about that sort of you were aware of between like sort of both sides of green extremist political positions.
Okay, thank you for the question. Well, of course, I didn't, green anarchism, okay, I mentioned it, but maybe this green anarchist ideology is more part of this Cascadian scene. So I didn't see any directly lyrics for bands who deal with it, I don't know, concrete, radical, green political theory or philosophy. So I don't know. Sorry, I forgot what is the sub question. Also.
If you encountered sort of any particular instances of tensions between eco-conservatism, which is represented in both hard left and hard right.
No, in this RABM, no, not yet. But maybe it will come in the future, I hope.
More questions? Okay, then I propose we make a pause and start again at 4:30, I think. Oh, and one more thing. All the speakers from today, or if there are any present that will speak tomorrow, if you could please come to me or Bobnic or Smole, because we have some informations for you.